Windham, Maine was founded based on a land grant in 1734 by colonists from Massachusetts, and it was officially settled in 1737. It was originally called New Marblehead. Most of the original settlers were farmers. The soil was loamy and easy to work with, and early farmers had access to the Presumpscott River for transportation. Windham, Maine was in a then frontier region which the French contested during a series of wars for control of North America through the early and mid-18th century. In the mid-18th century, the town of Windham was originally based around a fort made of a blockhouse surrounded by a stockade with a 9-bore cannon, which is 4.5 inches, which the townspeople took shelter in as the town was attacked by Native Americans, which happened twice, once in 1745 and again in 1751. The site of this fort was discovered and partially excavated last year. It's within walking distance of where I live. It's under a road, and traffic was slowed for a few weeks due to excavation. It's really interesting. The town was incorporated in 1762 as the 16th town in Maine. As I mentioned, Windham is on the Presumpscott River, which connects Sebago Lake, a small but sizable lake with a surface area of 28,771 acres. It's Maine's deepest lake, 300 feet deep. It's the primary water supply for the Portland, Maine Water District, whose service extends to the greater Portland area, which contains 15% of Maine's population. The lake is near where I live. It's a tourist area. There are beaches and boating. It's a cool place. There are several small islands in the lake which have people living on them. It's a really beautiful area. I've talked to people who grew up there, and they're very attached to the lake. It has special meaning for a lot of people. The Presumpscott River here flows from Sebago Lake to Casco Bay. And Presumpscott is a Wabanaki name and means river of rough places. So there were at least 12 falls along the river. And Portland, Maine is on the southern end of Casco Bay. The Presumpscott River is 25.8 miles long, which is a relatively short river, but in that distance, though, it drops 270 feet. So this region was inhabited by the Wabanaki Confederacy, confederation of Algonquin-speaking tribes in New England and the Canadian Maritimes. Wabanaki means people of the dawn. The Presumpscott River was sacred to the Wabanaki, who used it for fishing. And 250 years ago, around that time, there were vast amounts of Atlantic salmon would spawn. Shad and alewives would swim upriver. The Presumpscott was also home to landlocked salmon, brook trout, and the Presumpscott jumper fish, which is now extinct. People still fish there recreationally, not commercially as far as I know, and I usually see a lot of people fishing there when I walk my dogs during the spring and summer months. A lot of places to fish is very popular. Early English settlers, farmers mostly, got timber from that region. They sold it to the British Navy. It was a very lucrative trade for a time, and there are several landing points along the river where timber was sent from, and one was near Malison Falls, which is called Royal Mast Landing. The Presumpscott River was dammed in several places. The first dam was at Presumpscott Falls in Falmouth, Maine. In 1738, there were attempts to build a dam and sawmill in Malison Falls. This is Malison Falls today, by the way. This was opposed by Native Americans who lived in the area, who used the river for fishing and kind of depended on it for their livelihood. For centuries, indigenous people lived undisturbed in the area between Sebago Lake and Casco Bay, and their livelihood was very much tied to the Presumpscott River and its bounty of salmon, bass, trout, and other sea-bound fish. There was a major conflict between the indigenous people and English settlers over the river, and the details are complicated. There are conflicting accounts of what happened during that period. Colonel Thomas Westbrook, who lived from 1675 to 1743 about, or 74, was he was a New England militia leader in Maine during a conflict sometimes called the Father Rails War. So it was a complicated 3-year war between the French, the Wabanaki Confederacy allies, and the British and English settlers, which lasted from 1722 to 1725. Father Rail was a French priest who was exposed, I guess, as the military leader of the Wabanaki. This conflict has also been called Drummers' War, the 3 Years' War, and the Fourth Anglo-Wabanaki War. It was basically a conflict over the border between New England and the French colony of Arcadia. And as I've mentioned, was part of a larger conflict, which later led to what was called the French and Indian War, or the Great War for Empire, a titanic struggle from about 1754 to 1763 between England and France for control of North America, but that came a bit later. The French were eventually pushed out of New England and Canada. As an aside, I sometimes thought it was better if the French had won. It would have been somewhat better for Native Americans, for one. Very generally speaking, the French wanted to convert or assimilate the indigenous people. The English wanted to exterminate them. I'm generalizing a lot, a bit more complicated, but anyway. This Colonel Westbrook, who was a colonial militia leader, he was also an innkeeper, a land speculator. At one point, he owned 56,000 acres, and he was what was called a king's mast agent. He was a lucrative position in selecting trees used as mast by the British Navy. Very prestigious and lucrative job. He had a large estate where he entertained the then colonial Governor Belcher. By the way, Maine was a part of Massachusetts colony at that time. So the nearby town of Westbrook was actually named in honor of him. And there's a business plaza, too, named after him today. Anyway, in 1738, Colonel Westbrook planned and began promoting a dam sawmill project on the Presumpscott at Malison Falls, which was then called Horse Beef Falls. This was to be the biggest such project yet on the river. The problem is, it would block the fish migration route, endangering the livelihood of the indigenous people who depended on the fish. And this created friction with a band of about 25 Native Americans who lived in the area, kind of outside the fort. A guy named Chief Poulin was the leader of this group, and he organized resistance against the project. Chief Poulin actually walked to Boston twice, which was then the capital of it still is the capital of Massachusetts colony, to complain to the governor, Governor Belcher. And there's a blog, The River of Rough Places, is an interesting blog by Emma Deans, who's a local fan of the Presumpscott River, and she's worked on restoring the area around the river. She gives a lot of interesting local history on her blog, and if you're interested in this stuff, it's definitely worth the read. Anyway, Emma Deans quotes Chief Poulin's message to the governor saying, quote, What we are most aggrieved at is that the river Presumpscott is dammed up so that the passage of fish, which is our food, is obstructed, and that Colonel Westbrook did promise about 2 years ago that he would leave open a place in the dam, and that the fish should have free passage up the river into the pond in the proper season, but he has not performed that, and we are hereby deprived of our food. Poulin also requested that the English stop encroaching and settling on his tribe's land. Governor Belcher sent word to Colonel Westbrook, they were apparently friends, sent word to Colonel Westbrook to provide fish passage, and said he would look into the matter of land ownership, but nothing ever came of his promises. There's a very popular canon account of this event. It's called a book called Stephen Manchester, the Slayer of the Indian Chief Poulin at New Marblehead, now Windham, Maine, in 1756, and a soldier of the Revolution with his ancestry. Kind of a mouthful, but that was the name of a book written by Nathan Gould in 1896. And it's kind of like the standard account of what happened. It's about the events of May 1756. It's fascinating to read if you like local history. It's free online in the Internet Archive, which is a great resource. Anyway, Nathan Gould in this book says, in the summer of 1739, Chief Poulin, with other Indians, went to Boston and held a conference with the governor and council, where they stated their grievances. They wished a fishway kept open in the dam of Colonel Westbrook at the Presumpscott Lower Falls, and objected to the further settlement of the land on the river, as they wished the river for their trade. They also wished that some trader might be placed where it would be convenient to buy a small quantity of rum, but not enough to get drunk upon, as that was contrary to their religion. They also wanted a drum, as their young men wished to have a dance sometimes. They objected to a settlement at New Marblehead, saying that Sakurapa was as far as the English had a right to settle. Sakurapa was kind of an area in the town. There's an elementary school in Westbrook called Sakurapa, where I worked as a substitute teacher, as an aside. So the name pops up, Sakurapa pops up in the town of Westbrook here and there. Anyway, so in reply to this demand from Chief Poulin, the governor ordered a fishway in the dam, and also that the Indians be treated kindly. But he told them there had been deeds of the land already given to Reverend Robert Jordan and others, which had been burned during the Indian War, probably in Jordan's house at Spurwink in 1675. He then told them that the opportunities for getting rum were sufficient. The Indians, at the end of each request, laid down a skin, saying it was the pledge of the tribe, whom they called the Presumpscotts. And that's the quote from Nathan Gould's version of the story. So it appears that the fishway was promised but never happened, and the settlers continued to encroach on the band's historic land. Tensions escalated, and Poulin's people were armed. As Emma Dean said, Poulin eventually armed his people to fight for access to something that had been theirs for generations. One day a fight broke out. Poulin was killed, shot by a man named Stephen Manchester. The blog I mentioned references an account from another writer that on May 14th, 1756, local settlers Stephen Manchester, Ezra Brown, Everin Winship, Abraham Anderson, Joseph Starling, Jonan Farrow, and 4 boys were walking through the woods to work on Ezra Brown's land near the fort. The local Wabanaki tribe, armed with muskets, staged an attack. Winship, who was a farmer on this land, received a shot in the eye and arm. Both were scalped. The fighting climaxed when Chief Poulin fired at Anderson, exposing his location to Manchester, who fired and killed Poulin. Stephen Manchester then became a local hero for his act, which was seen as finally ending the long conflict and basically opening the area to capitalist development. Later, Stephen Manchester fought in the Revolutionary War, and after this incident, Poulin's group retreated from the area and vanished from history, and we don't know what happened to them. As I mentioned, Stephen Manchester was considered a local hero for killing Poulin. Nathan Gould wrote about this, quote, the death of Poulin brought peace and happiness to the border settlements, and of course the settlers felt grateful to Manchester for killing him. A tradition is that Manchester was offered a township for his reward, but declined the offer, saying it was reward enough to have killed the skunk. Poulin's tribe carried him several miles into the woods and buried him beneath a young tree, which years later provided inspiration for New England Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, The Funeral Tree of the Secaucus. Emma Dean writes in her blog, which I'll provide a link for, very interesting to read, quote, having lost their leader, the Abenaki presence on the Presumpscott disappeared. The tribe seemed to have broken up, joining scattered bands from other tribes or else moving north, away from their homeland. Manchester went on to fight in the Revolutionary War before settling down at a small farm he built in Windham, and the town became more prosperous and populated. As the native presence in the area faded, the environmental problems rapidly increased. No longer fearing Chief Poulin's impassioned fight for fish passage, white settlers moved forward with their development plans. The river would forever be altered. So I heard an interview about 6 or 7 months ago on the local college radio station, WNPG, with someone from the Friends of the Presumpscott, which is a non-profit group working on historical and environmental preservation of the river. I'm not a member, but they seem like they're doing good work. Anyway, the person interviewed described this incident and said Chief Poulin's killing was not just a killing, but was murder. It was another incident in the long history of indigenous people being dispossessed. I'd like to do further research on this myself and eventually make a more in-depth video on this in the future, but for now I'm basically just touching on this history. Here I'll mention that the Portland, Maine School District hosted a sort of participatory workshop on Wabanaki history for employees as well as anyone in the community. I went to it. It's very moving. Basically, it described how the Wabanaki were more and more dispossessed like other Native American groups. They had their children taken away, put in boarding schools with very high rates of sexual abuse, rampant contagious diseases, etc. And it was put on by a group called Wabanaki Reach, a nonprofit organization which works on educating people about Wabanaki issues. Anyway, today this area near where the fort was located is on the intersection of Anderson Road and River Road. By the way, this is actually a very dangerous intersection today, and there have been numerous very bad car accidents over the past few years. Dangerous turn. Okay, so Chief Poulin for many years was kind of an unrecognized, obscure figure. Few people actually had ever heard of him. I live here, and I only heard of him about a year ago, to be honest. In September of 2018, the nonprofit group Friends of the Presumpscott River dedicated a memorial to him in the town of Westbrook. And as I mentioned, in 1738, a mill was built at Mallison Falls. That area of the river, now between the towns of Windham and Gorham, has a very sharp drop. It's great for water power, and it was a popular area for mills. Anyway, fast forward. So between 1817 and 1824, a sawmill in the nearby Gambo Falls was bought by two gunpowder makers from Massachusetts, Lester Laughlin and Edmund Fowler, and was converted to a powder mill to make gunpowder. Their firm was called the Gorham Powder Company, but was popularly known as the Gambo Powder Mills. This was the first powder mill built in Maine, and it remained in operation for about 80 years, longer than any other powder mill in the state. In addition to being the largest powder mill in Maine, it is believed to have been the fourth largest in the U.S. for a large part of the 19th century. Lester Laughlin was the founder of this mill, was a grandson of the Revolutionary War gunpowder manufacturer Matthew Laughlin, and the Laughlin family made gunpowder in Massachusetts for several generations. Lester came east to Maine, and some of his cousins built gunpowder mills in New York and Chicago, as well as Massachusetts. In 1827, the founders of the company, Lester Laughlin, Edmund Fowler, and the powder mill's foreman, died in a freak boating accident on Sebago Lake, although I don't actually have the details. It was kind of a bizarre accident. Shortly thereafter, the mill itself was taken over by a Lowell gunpowder manufacturer, Oliver Whipple. Whipple was the grandson of a Revolutionary War officer. He learned gunpowder manufacturing from the Laughlin family. Shortly after the boating accident, which killed the founder of the Gambo powder mill, Whipple took over. He moved much of his operation to Maine, partly to relocate to a less populated area. Gunpowder making back then was an extremely dangerous industry, and partly to get closer to the charcoal supply, which was an ingredient of gunpowder. Maine had an abundant wood resources, and charcoal, of course, very important gunpowder. To illustrate how dangerous the industry was, there was an explosion in July 1828, shortly after Whipple took over, which killed 7 employees. In 1832, the Cumberland-Oxford Canal was opened, which connected the larger lakes of southern Maine, including Sebago, with Portland Harbor. It ran along the Presumpscott. There was a system of 27 locks to reach sea level from Sebago, and flat-bottom canal boats were used to transport goods. In the late 1820s and early 1830s was the great age of canal building in the U.S., sometimes called the Canal Age. This was spurred by the success of the Erie Canal, which was finished in 1825 and connected the Hudson River in New York City with the Great Lakes in what was then the western U.S. And after that time, many other canals were built as part of the U.S. Industrial Revolution of the time. They were, of course, overtaken by the railroad, but many continued to be used into the 1870s and 1880s. Anyway, parts of the canal This canal fell into disuse in the 1850s. There's a lock in Naples, Maine on Lake Sebago, which today is an upscale boating and tourism community on Sebago Lake, which is still used today for pleasure boating. Anyway, concurrent with the canal opening in 1823, Oliver Whipple expanded the gunpowder mill. The canal enabled him to bring in the ingredients for gunpowder, were saltpeter from India, sulfur from Italy, and charcoal from nearby Sebago Lake. Lumber was brought from northern Maine forest and was used to make barrels for transport and gunpowder. Each barrel could hold about 25 pounds of gunpowder. They were shipped in canal boats to Portland and sometimes all the way to Boston if the weather was good. In the winter, during times the canal was frozen, they were transported by horse-drawn sleighs. A canal boat could carry about 25 tons. As I've mentioned, this was a very dangerous industry. There were further plant explosions which killed actually one employee each in 1835, 1847, 1849, and 1850. In October of 1851, there was a major explosion which killed 7 employees, which included Oliver Whipple's brother and son, injured 5 more people, and destroyed a canal boat and parts of the mill. Emma Deans writes in her blog, quote, "Both doctors and undertakers would ready their wagons upon hearing explosions in Gorham and Windham. Men ran towards the mill for 2 reasons. They were headed to help, or they were looking for a job, because someone had most likely died." It was a very dangerous profession and very lucrative for the undertakers. It was dangerous, but it was also a high-paying industry for that period. In the 1870s and 1880s, workers made $2 for a 10-hour workday, which was 50 cents to $1 more than the going rate that time. Workers took precautions like wearing boots made of wooden pegs instead of nails to avoid sparks. Despite this, overall, though, 46 men died from explosions at the Gunpowder Mill. In Shore Park, as I'll show, the Presumpscott Regional Land Trust has posted signs that indicate where the remnants of the old wheels are and where the charcoal house used to be, located on an island in Presumpscott. I was actually originally going to make a video about the deaths at the gunpowder mill and the hazardous working conditions, but the available information I found sent me in other directions, but the deaths are still a chilling aspect of this place. This was non-union work, of course. This period was during the transition from a small-scale artisan production to bigger firms and the more centralized production of late 19th century monopoly capitalism. Anyway, in response to these constant explosions at powder mills, the gunpowder industry adopted today what I guess would be called just-in-time production, making gunpowder in response to orders received instead of storing gunpowder. This change was adopted at the Presumpscott Mill, but it actually required a great deal of water power on demand. The canal management, who were of course interested in keeping their customers happy, their customers at the mill happy, coordinated release of water through the system of locks to keep a high volume of water running. But the high demand for water during this time created conflicts between local water users. Water users in the nearby town of Westbrook, which I assume included residential users as well as various industries, were really unhappy about the timing of water releases. There was a lawsuit initiated in 1877 during a drought, and legal wrangling continued for months between the Oriental Power Company and Westbrook water users, while the water releases were actually determined by whichever side had enough employees to control the former canal dam at Sebago Lake. And so I haven't been able to identify this exactly. I believe this canal dam was in the town of Naples. Anyway, this provides an interesting example of unregulated capitalism, and I imagine brawls broke out. Finally, in 1878, legislation was passed which gave control of water releases from Sebago Lake to Westbrook users, being that Sebago was the then biggest town in the area. In 1855, the facilities, the gunpowder mill facilities, were bought by a Gilbert Grafton Newell, a Salem, Massachusetts businessman, specifically to manufacture gunpowder for the Crimean War. And the Crimean War was a war in southern Russia between England, France, and Turkey, then the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. It turned out to be a disaster for everyone involved and showed monumental incompetence for all the militaries involved on all sides. Russia lost the conflict, and as a result, the Russian Empire, which was once called the gendarme of Europe and was the chief reactionary power of Europe, was far weaker in the second half of the 19th century than it was in the first. Anyway, the Gambo Mill complex was rebuilt, reorganized, and enlarged. In 1859, it was renamed the Oriental Powder Company. I don't know the significance of the term Oriental in this context. Could be a reference to the fact that Maine, which had become a state in 1820, was in the far east of the U.S., or it could have been a reference from Freemasonry, which played a big, if so sometimes underground role in 19th century America during that time. A charcoal house, saltpeter refinery, wheel mills, press mills, kerneling mills, glazing mills, and storehouses were dispersed along both banks of the river, and the canal for a mile upstream of Gambo had to minimize damage during the now more infrequent explosions. So it was somewhat safer. A small company town named called Newell was built to house employees. It was built some distance away, so if there was an explosion, at least the wives and children of the employees would survive. Today there's Newell Street across from Gambo Street, which leads to the Windham side of Shore Park, and I assume this is where the company town was located. The Oriental Powder Company's head office was located in Portland, again to protect the management and avoid business disruption in case of an explosion. At least the management would survive. During the U.S. Civil War, the Oriental Powder Company in Gorham, Windham produced more than a quarter of the military-grade gunpowder used by the Union forces during the Civil War, and peak annual production during the war years exceeded 2,500,000 pounds. It was one of the largest gunpowder manufacturers in the U.S., although it was dwarfed by the DuPont and Hazard Company mills of the time. Hazard Powder Company mills of the time, which produced about a third of the gunpowder supply of the Union during the Civil War. According to some accounts, the Oriental Powder Company was originally the fourth largest manufacturer of gunpowder in the U.S., but by the time of the Civil War, the fourth largest supplier were the Laughlin cousins, who later became the early smokeless powder manufacturer Laughlin and Rand. Anyway, during the Civil War, the DuPont mill in Delaware, which was a border state with many Confederate sympathizers, was considered too close to the battle lines and too vulnerable by sabotage by Southern sympathizers. The Oriental Powder Company was, of course, an important employer in the Windham-Gorham area at that time. In 1859, Windham's population was 2,380. It's still a small town. Besides the gunpowder mill, it had 8 sawmills, a corn and flour mill, 2 shingle mills, a fulling mill, 2 carding mills, a woolen textile factory, a barrel factory, a chair stuff factory, and 2 tanneries. After the Civil War, the demand for military gunpowder fell sharply, and the company went bankrupt. In 1872, it was reincorporated as the Oriental Powder Mills. Anyway, demand for gunpowder declined when the Civil War ended, but picked up briefly during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. As I've mentioned, most of the Cumberland-Oxford Canal fell into disuse after a railroad was completed through the town of South Windham, which is technically where I live, and Newell in 1875. The availability of year-round transportation was an economic shot in the arm for the area. Flooding actually destroyed much of Windham in the 1870s, but it rapidly recovered. There was lots of small, tight-knit communities in this area, and you can still see reflections of this today in local road signs. A pulp mill was built in Windham, and industrial village grew up around South Windham. A variety of other industries took off in the 1880s. There was a Mallison Falls woolen mill. There were 2 big pulp mills on either side of the river. During that time, bought out by Androscoggin Mills. They closed with the decline of the pulp mill industry in Maine by the 1950s. In 1919, a reformatory for men was created. It's still there. It's now the Maine Correctional Facility, a state prison for men and women. I pass by it almost every day. It's a horrible place. One time last year, I drove past this place at night with a dog. I then had Cupcake. My dog Cupcake was having health issues, and she went into a convulsion as I was driving past the state prison. So the prison parking lot, was in the nearest place to pull over. There were no signs saying I couldn't. So I pulled over to look at my dog. I was kind of worried about her. And as I pulled into the parking lot, it was an adjunct it was a parking lot of an adjunct building of the prison. Someone had earlier told me it was a women's release facility. Anyway, it wasn't the main part of the prison. So right after I pulled in there, I saw 3 cops come running towards me, as well as a police SUV. It was scary. I thought it was going to turn into a tense situation. A policewoman who was driving the SUV approached me. I told her about my dog. She was initially sympathetic, then she scolded me. I told her I'd leave. No, I want to leave. And I started to drive out. Then another police SUV blocked me. So I politely told the cops who were approaching me on foot that an SUV was blocking me. The vehicle was then moved, and I left. And I was scared. My dog seemed okay by that point. I quickly left. I could sort of understand what happened. The cops thought I was going to aid in a prison break or something. There were no signs I couldn't park there, and there was no fence or security gate or whatever, just public parking. The police overreaction was weird, and I hate with a passion the whole police legal prison system. Anyway, in the 1880s, after the Civil War, there were major changes in the gunpowder industry, and as smaller Maine gunpowder mills went out of business following the war, the Oriental Powder Company acquired their assets, and the machinery was salvaged from these mills. So the company expanded nationwide, and a subsidiary, Oriental Powder Company of Pennsylvania, began manufacturing rock blasting powder at Fairchance, Pennsylvania in 1902. Also, with the wider availability of the telegraph, which helped in sales, communications, gunpowder industries could be stored further away from manufacturing plants and were often located in Chicago and Salt Lake City at that time. As forest resources were exhausted, local supplies of charcoal and wood for making barrels became more and more expensive. The demand for blasting powder for mining and railroad building, which was a big market for powder mills, fluctuated amid an extended semi-depression throughout the late 19th century. The Newell Mill ceased operation in 1893 as dynamite and smokeless powder became more preferred than traditional gunpowder. The Newell Mill, I meant the Oriental Powder Mill. The mill now was under the control of the Eastern Dynamite Company, began making dynamite in 1895. There were 3 fatal explosions in the last 10 years of the mill's operation as an explosive manufacturer, and 4 people in total were killed. So the last explosion in the mill was in March of 1904. Gunpowder production ended in that year after an 80-year run. And after 1904, the mill was solely used for making wood flour, which is an ingredient in dynamite, which was shipped elsewhere to be mixed with nitroglycerin. And the mill was briefly owned by DuPont, the vast chemical manufacturing company based in Delaware. Ownership passed the Atlas Powder Company in 1912. Wood flour production actually continued into the 1950s. After that time, the lumber mills of Maine, which was a big industry, declined with many mills closing. Civil War cannon called the Columbiad remained at this region called Newell, the Newell Mills, until it was scrapped during the Second World War. Shaw Park, where I go to almost every day to walk my dogs, it was opened in 2006 after Shaw Brothers, a local building company, donated land to the Presumpscott Regional Land Trust in 1995. It's a really nice park with trails and several bridges, and it bisects the towns of Gorham and Windham on opposite sides of the Presumpscott River. The Windham side, which I'll show, has remnants of the old Cumberland-Oxford Canal, as well as the stone foundation of gunpowder mills that operated in the 1800s. The Presumpscott Regional Land Trust has posted signs throughout the trails to indicate where the remnants of the old wheels are and where the charcoal house used to be. The Gorham side has a small but really nice beach on the river. And a lot of people go there. The park is very popular in warm weather, and as I said, I walk my dogs there, Max and Molly, who are with me right now. I take them there for a walk almost every day. Maurice Whidden, who's a former chemistry professor at University of Southern Maine, has extensively researched this, and in his book, The Gunpowder Mills of Gorham, Maine, he goes into extended detail on the history of the mills. It's really fascinating. And in the near future, I hope to make a more extended video or series of videos on local history, which actually is really interesting. There's a slight departure. Anyway, if you like my work, please share and especially subscribe. I'm trying to get up to 100 subscribers by September. Anyway, thank you very much. Goodbye.